Hello, my name is Kevin Andersson. I'm Professor of Energy and Climate Change and have a joint appointment between the Tyndall Centre at the University of Manchester, CEMUS at the University of Uppsala, and CET at the University of Bergen. Rosemary asked me to contribute to your event tomorrow, but unfortunately I had something already scheduled for then. So she sent me a few questions, 4 questions through, and asked if I'd make a quick reply to those. So I pulled together a brief PowerPoint going through those points here. So hopefully it will be helpful for you tomorrow. So the first question I was asked was, why is it important that scientists and higher education institutes, universities and so forth, practice what they teach the students about the climate crisis? Now, on this, I wanted to touch on two issues. And what I'm talking about here, there'll be lots of other things. It's just my immediate thoughts rather than a sort of a comprehensive consideration of all the points. But the first of these is credibility. That when we hear arguments being made by anyone in society, we give greater credibility to what they are saying if we can broadly see that their lifestyles or their institutions have practices that are in line with the arguments that they're making. And there's a whole wealth of psychology evidence that has shown that over many years, that credibility is incredibly important here. So it doesn't change whether the arguments are right or wrong, but it does lend them greater sort of sense of belief. We will take them more on board if we see some alignment between what's being said and what's being done. But I also want to pick apart slightly the question itself. So this idea of when we teach the students, I think it's fair to say when we're talking about climate science, then there's a lot that we have learned as academics and as the scientific community that we know sufficiently well that we can teach the students. But when it comes to reducing our emissions, which is a different thing altogether, I mean, it relies on some science and some technology and so forth, but also it's deeply political and cultural. But when we look at reducing emissions, we have fundamentally failed. So I think that asks different questions of the relationship between the student and the teacher. Many people have tried for 2-3 decades, if not more, to bring our emissions down, but collectively, the empirical data suggests that we have failed and failed very significantly. And therefore, we're looking for new ways to think about these issues. And the insight from students may be just as important as it is from the lecturers. In fact, it may even be more important because you'll be looking at the world through a different set of eyes with new lenses to see what is happening, and you may come up with new avenues to address this issue. The second question I was asked was, why are universities, etc., not practicing what they preach? I'm going to touch on two things here. The first one is that we know that emissions correlate very closely with wealth and status, and the academics typically have done very well in our systems, or at least this, and it's not just the established academics, the senior lecturers and the professors have done well, and the others going into university and working their way through the system, also aspiring to do well on both of these fronts, both in terms of wealth and in terms of status. To be brutally obvious, we're part of what is often referred to as the mobile elite. And that means we broadly have high levels of consumption. We typically live in bigger houses. We're paid a lot more. We typically live in larger houses. Sometimes we have second homes. We have bigger cars. We probably drive further. We'll fly a lot further. And we were much less likely to use things like buses and some other forms of public transport. So across the board, we're going to have higher levels of emissions. But with our institutions, we've also locked in a whole suite of high carbon practices that also feed in to this individual high carbon lifestyles that we have as well. Firstly, we've got this idea of teaching where there's been a real significant focus on internationalization. How can we bring people in from other parts of the world? Now, that's significantly driven by the fact is that they usually have to pay a lot more money. But it's more than that. It is the idea that we think that we have these pearls of wisdom that we can bestow on these other people. And sometimes that is true. And other times, I think there is a degree of arrogance locked into that. But nevertheless, what we have got is for various reasons, we've got an agenda, a teaching agenda, which requires lots and lots of travel to bring in students from elsewhere. On research, obviously lots of good research is done, but I do think some of the field work is still deeply embedded in the colonial view of the world, the sort of arrogant view of the world, that we in the rich parts of the world will fly to other parts of the world to undertake research there and then bring the information back and then carry on with some academic papers and so forth over here. Why is it we can't readjust that system so actually we sort of engage on a more equal partnership level with people elsewhere rather than us having to travel there? And I'll come back to that in a minute, actually. Then there's also the issue of engagement and prestige, in that we like to be at the top table with the great and the good, discussing how we can incrementally tweak the existing system, rather than actually pushing at that table, saying actually the sorts of things you're talking about are far removed from what we need to do to deliver on our Paris commitments. But the prestige comes from engaging with these other people who are typically also part of the mobile elite. So the whole sort of structure here is one of high emissions, high income, and high levels of prestige. So how can students impact universities to take more notice of the climate science and reduce their emissions? Well, firstly, I think it's important to recognize that students are the lifeblood of most universities, and that actually gives you a huge amount of power, both financial power, and the universities are reliant on the income either directly paid by the students or given to the universities by government because of their student numbers, but also the ability then of the students collectively to hold their lecturers and their vice chancellor to account for their actions. So there's a lot of power there that I think collectively you can hopefully apply appropriately within the institutions of higher education. But I think there are some key elements to this. Firstly, you need to be cogent. We need to really think through what are the arguments that we have, and not just at the reductions level, but also at the system level. We need to have integrity, that we don't hide in that whole suite of assertions or other political beliefs, and have the cogency sort of hide these more sort of personal views of how we'd like the world to be. And then we also need the courage to stand up and to be counted, and so to take our arguments and put them out there for people to counter or agree with and to discuss. And there are multiple avenues of engagement for doing this. There's the formal committees that most universities have. There's our local and national papers and local and national radio shows. There's social media and protests and all these other things out there. There's a whole suite of ways of engaging. And students typically are well educated and reasonably eloquent, so there's no reason they shouldn't be out there getting their voices heard. I would also argue that there are a few other sort of characteristics that are important here. Firstly, to have some sort of firmness, to think your arguments through, and then once you've thought them through, stand by them. Unless someone points out that there's something wrong within them. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. But also clarity, make sure that arguments are clear, that people can understand what it is that we're saying. Be courteous, firm but courteous, and it's not always easy to be courteous. And we all found this from time to time, but generally it is better to be courteous. To have some humility, which goes back to the idea of firmness, that we will occasionally get things wrong, or think actually the argument is more subtle than that. There's something I hadn't thought about. And it's important to reflect on that and go back and change our views and be open about that process. But also, I think some humor can help get things across. So it's a combination of these facets that help us get across the importance of our messages. So the fourth question I was asked is, do you have any tips about what emissions are most important and how we can tackle them? I'm just going to touch on this here, because there's obviously multiple ways you can engage in this within your own institutions. But the first thing I think we have to recognize, well, what we have to do is to avoid locking in any future or ongoing high carbon practices and infrastructures. If you play that out across the sort of portfolio of activities in the university, we need to think about our buildings. We're going to have to retrofit the older stock. You can't just sell them off to someone else. Unless we're going to demolish them and build some new ones, we need to make sure that we retrofit older stock so that they are suitable for the reduced energy consumption that's necessary in the 21st century, but also to be able to adapt to the changing climate and indeed the changing requirements of students and of research within a university. But also all new buildings need to be passive plus. In other words, have zero carbon or zero energy demands to keep them heated and so forth. And also include some on-site renewables to help deal with power requirements of IT equipment and laboratory equipment and so forth. And we know how to do a lot of these things. They're slightly more expensive to build, but their operational costs are much lower. In terms of procurement, we need strict efficiency standards on what it is we procure and buy in universities. So all the equipment and so forth. But also, it's not just a point about having it being efficient, but also if we buy lots of it, then it's also going to still have lots of emissions. So make sure that we only buy what we need and to think through what do we actually need. And also on this, I would say, finally, we need to think about how do we embed some sort of modular standard so that we can repair the things that we have. So when something breaks down, rather than just throw it away and buy a new one, we can actually repair it. So the university should be showing some leadership on all of those things in its procurement policies. On travel, which is probably the issue that most people think about within universities now in terms of emissions, where possible, we should try to do things virtually. It is the ideas that matter, not the physical presence of the person who has the ideas. So let's try and use as much virtual ways of engagement as is possible and as is effective. And of course, COVID-19 has helped us improve on that and also realize some of its limitations. When it comes to more physical travel, no cars, and ideally no taxis, ideally use buses and so forth. And there may be some exceptions to this, but by and large, the exceptions should be literally that, exceptions. No business or first class unless there's medical reasons for using those. And remember, the upper echelons of our university not uncommonly fly business class. And major cuts in flights. We should not be flying unless there's almost an emergency situation. That shouldn't really be happening for us as academics. So very occasional. Let's develop internal and non-hierarchical protocols for our travel policies to make sure they are low carbon and sustainable. And let's report on them. And when I say non-hierarchical, they shouldn't be ones that just favor the upper echelons, the professors, the senior lecturers, and the other great and good in our universities. Not, typically those that fly a lot and travel a lot, but it's not necessarily those that have the greatest degree of sort of innovative thinking about the problems we're facing. So perhaps if anyone's going to travel a lot, it should be some of the younger, more innovative, creative academics and researchers. Going back to the point earlier about colonialism and research, particularly for field work, rather than us flying to other parts of the world and collecting information and bringing it back, could we not have a much more fruitful partnership and engagement with some other indigenous communities or countries in other parts of the world? So they will undertake the research. We'll provide some equipment and some training if necessary. They'll undertake the field work and we'll develop a relationship and a partnership with them, rather than we will simply fly there, get the information and fly back and have sort of very colonial view that we have developed. And that means we can reduce our travel, we can reduce our emissions, and we can have a much better relationship, I think, with other parts of the world. We're going to have to reschedule our undergraduate courses, particularly, but also our postgraduate courses, so that they require far less travel or opportunity for much slower and therefore lower emissions in our traveling. I'm not sure what that will look like, but maybe it's 2-year degrees, maybe it's much more that we'll engage virtually with courses elsewhere in the world. So, thinking that through, how that would look. In terms of food on campus, we need a strong ethical and emissions focus. Food is an important part of the climate change story. About 20% of the warming comes from food-related emissions. So we need to make sure that we embed some sort of strong sustainability practices within our universities there. And finally, I'll come back to the broader framing of sustainability and the sort of equity element of that and the social element of sustainability. And we do also know that people on high incomes have much higher emissions. And I think we need to be looking to reduce the income differentials within our universities. Currently we have cleaners paid very, very poor salaries certainly in the UK, on 0 hours contracts. We have a lot of the security people, again, very poor working conditions on relatively low income. And yet we've got other people on with excellent packages on really good sort of pensions and so forth, and sick pay, and also paid a lot of money. We need to reduce those differentials, maybe a maximum of 3 or something like that, rather than probably 6, 7, up to 10 we must be seeing in some of our universities. A final comment on leadership. Leadership is not bestowed on us from people above us. It is a messy partnership between bottom up and top down. In a sense, it's deeply emergent. We don't know who's going to be or which group of people are going to be the catalysts for change. If you think about it, just a few years ago, would anyone have thought a 15-year-old schoolgirl would have more influence on climate change than the head of the United Nations? We wouldn't be able to predict that in advance, and that's the point about it being emergent. But by recognizing that puts much greater responsibility for good leadership on our shoulders. It's not just solely the responsibility of the great and the good, of the leaders within the countries, within our councils, within our institutions. It also becomes our responsibility. But that is exactly what your network seems to be about. So that's a really positive move in the right direction. So on that note, thanks for listening, and all the best with your event tomorrow.